Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our post-conference event as part of the 28th AMIC Annual Conference. My name is Mark Lester Chico from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, College of Development Communication. I am the president of the Philippine Association of Communication Educators, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. How are you doing?
Great.
We are ready for the future of journalism education in the world with focus on Asia Pacific. And this is what we're going to talk about this afternoon. But before I proceed, allow me to welcome us all, the chair of AMIC himself, Dr. Crispin Maslog. So Chris, good afternoon po.
Good afternoon, Mark. Glad to see you. Greetings of peace and good health to everyone, wherever and whatever time zone you are. I recognize Dr. Guy Berger, Director of Strategy and Policy of UNESCO, an old friend, Dr. Berika Rupar, Chairperson, World Journalism Education Council. And the main speaker this afternoon, Dr. Nico Drop, Vice Chairperson, World Journalism Education Council. I am a founding member of AMIC. Believe it or not, I was there when AMIC was founded 50 years ago. Now I am 90 years old, and I have been a journalist for at least 70 years, longer than any of you in my audience have lived. I started as a reporter, then editor of our high school paper, during the era of the letterpress, if any of you recognize that. My first journalism textbook, believe it or not, was an American government issue paper-bound book for American soldiers in World War II in 1941. The title, Modern News Reporting by Carl Warren. This paperback, which I picked up by accident at the end of World War II in 1945, became my Bible in journalism, and my high school paper was my workbook, where I learned about the 5 W's and the 1 H. I then went to college and took up journalism. I had a one-track mind. After 6 years, 4 in journalism and 2 in arts and philosophy, I earned 2 bachelor's degrees. My first job was as copy editor of Agence France Press in Manila. After 4 years as a journalist, I got a scholarship for graduate studies, a master's degree in journalism, and a PhD in mass communication at the University of Minnesota in the US. I came home to the Philippines in 1967 as the first Philippine PhD in mass communication. Excuse me. And I taught for the next 50 years. You would think that I have retired from journalism after all these years, but not really. Since I stopped writing and teaching journalism and mass comm, I became an opinion writer in 2012. I accepted a paid position as science columnist for SciDevNet, a London-based world science news service. I earned British pounds, which I deposited in my US dollar bank account, and I spent in pesos in the Philippines. I am still doing that until today, at the ripe old age of 90. I thought it would be an easy transition from work as a journalist, writing about facts and letting the facts speak for themselves, and never mind my own opinion. However, slowly by slowly, after countless arguments with my SciDevNet editors in London, I began to realize that I had become a die-hard journalist. I found it difficult to express my own opinion. If I had to, I would first lay out the facts and say, this is where the facts lead me to conclude. My British editors would then ask me, what is your opinion about these facts? They wanted my opinion, exclamation point. Imagine that, exclamation point. As if it mattered, exclamation point. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the crux of the matter. I had been trained to gather facts and assemble them into a meaningful whole as a journalist my whole life, only to be told later as a columnist that I was now expected to express an opinion because I was writing a column. So when you graduate from a reporter, you become an opinion maker. And with this gem of wisdom, I welcome every one of you who are only 19 years old or more, or less, to a one-day post-conference on the future of journalism education in the world and in Asia Pacific. Let the facts lead you to an opinion, not the other way around. Good day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crispin Maslog. Of course, he is the chairman of the board of directors of the Asian Media Information and Communication Center. And I must say, I am always very happy to see him as part of our family here at DEFCOM. So once again, this is our post-conference event organized by AMIC and of course the World Journalism Education Council with support from UNESCO. Now to welcome us all, allow me to introduce to you the chairwoman of the World Journalism Education Council, Dr. Verica Rupar.
Thank you, Mark. Greetings from the South Pacific, from Auckland, New Zealand. It's hard to talk after Professor Maslog, I have to say. It just reminds me again how great journalists and great journalism educators open a new world to all of us. And my immediate reaction is to ask Dr. Maslog for an interview now instead of doing welcoming talk to this event. But my task is different, and I'm talking and I'm welcoming you as a chairperson of the World Journalism Education Council. This roundtable on the future of journalism education nicely wraps up a series of roundtables that we are organizing. The WJC is organizing this year with the support of UNESCO on journalism education for the 21st century. It's part of our ongoing dialogue about the issues, challenges, and opportunities for journalism educators. So far, we have had 15 roundtables, and 2 more are to come, this one and one in China at the end of December. 17 roundtables in 15 countries across the world. All of them engaged in the dialogue about where journalism program stands, what do we teach our students, why does it matter, what can we do to improve journalism curriculum. What did we learn so far? The full report about these roundtables will be available in January on WJEC website. But what I have gathered so far can be systematized in three broad themes. Journalism educators are concerned about journalism place in society. We are living in the age of misinformation. We are experiencing the world of news media and journalism practice that is not completely able to engage with the most pressing issues of a day. Many roundtables were discussing how journalists report on these issues and what we can do in a classroom to equip them with knowledge and skills that are necessary to engage with the social reality. That's one set of issues. The other set of issues is about the place of journalism programs within the university. About the need to have transdisciplinary approach to journalism education, about sort of a backwater that one part of journalism studies put us all together. And these colleagues who were discussing these issues are suggesting to open a dialogue about that. The third set of issues, and I'm just briefly summing this up because I think it's important for what we are going to discuss today. The third set of issues is about journalism education and its relation with the industry. And many of us, and I say us, have been arguing for some time that there is a need for journalism education to move from being industry focused towards being community focused. And that's a topic for another discussion. WJC has many activities. These roundtables and the discussion about the future of journalism education is one of them. The other is research, and the most significant research in recent years is the one that Nico will be talking about today, a survey of journalism educators' perception of the place of journalism in society. We also organize conferences, and I would like to wrap up my welcoming talk by inviting you all to join us next year. On the 30th of June, we will have an online conference, WJC online conference, and I will share details about the conference when the time comes. Kia ora, everyone, and thank you so much, AMIC and Academy of Journalism Education in Hanoi, and of course UNESCO, for setting up a stage for this type of conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Dr. Rupar. Now, to give us an overview of our forum this afternoon, allow me to call in the Secretary General of AMIC, Professor Ramon R. Tuaza. Sir Ramon.
Thank you, Professor Mark. Welcome to our 28th AMIC Annual Conference post-conference event. For those who, for some reasons, were not able to join us, our recent annual conference was held on 20 and 27 November and December 4. Our theme was Science Communication, Managing the Now and the Future. A few days ago, two journalists, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, were honored as 2021 Nobel Peace Prize laureates. Listening to their speeches during the awarding ceremony gives a preview of many challenges journalists worldwide are facing today and in the future. Now the question we need to ask is, can we train journalists who can address these current and emerging issues and challenges? Early this year, as mentioned by Professor Rupar, WJEC did a survey entitled Journalistic Roles, Values, and Qualifications in the 21st Century: How Journalism Educators Across the Globe View the Future of a Profession in Transition. The results of this international comparative study will be presented at the WJEC Congress in Beijing, mentioned earlier in June 2022. AHMIC is very proud to have coordinated the research work in 13 selected Asia-Pacific countries, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The online survey period was from January 7 to February 28, 2021. There were 239 respondents from these 13 countries. There were also other Asian countries which participated in this survey, particularly China, Australia, and New Zealand. A close look at the survey results will enable journalism teachers to craft curricula that will ensure the relevance of journalism education and its survival amidst assault of authoritarianism and intrusive technology in many countries. Many of the issues and challenges in journalism profession now faces are endemic in Asian countries. We are confident that in this forum, our educator panelists will be able to critically examine and will propose responses from an Asian lens. The journalism education issues that Professor Drock will present. Over 1,000 registered for today's forum. I don't know how many of these 1,000 registered participants will attend. They come from 42 countries, including countries outside of Asia Pacific. We thank the World Journalism Education Council for partnering with us in this event. We also thank our partner, the Academy of Journalism and Communication in Vietnam, and of course, the support of UNESCO, which supported the conduct of this forum. 50 years ago, when AMIC was established in Singapore, our vision was to contribute an Asian perspective on journalism and communication issues. This vision remains, but with this vision comes the need to commit to universal values of free expression and the defense for truth. I look forward to a productive and disruptive discussion. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
Maraming salamat and mabuhay, Professor Ramon Tuazon. Now we are ready for our forum proper. Allow me to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Our speaker is a professor of media and civil society at Windesheim University of Applied Science, Zavala, the Netherlands. His main research interests are journalism education, civic journalism, and news media use of young people. He is vice chair of the World Journalism Education Council and project leader of the WJEC research on journalistic roles, values, and qualifications in the 21st century. How journalism educators across the globe view the future of a profession in transition. He is counselor of the European Journalism Training Association. He has been working in journalism education for more than 40 years. He studied institutional economics and sociology at the universities of Rotterdam and Groningen and completed his PhD in social sciences at the University of Nijmegen. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, please welcome Dr. Nico Drock.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, for these nice words, and a greeting to all of you from the Netherlands. It's still dark outside here because it's early in the morning, but nevertheless, it is an honor and a privilege for me to be able to speak to you this afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have 40 slides, so if you are bored, you can count and know how long it will take. And let's start by moving to the next slide. And I cannot do this myself, so I have to ask Fernando to do it. Yes, it has already been said. WGAC has done a research, or is in the process of doing a research on journalism role and journalistic roles, values, and qualifications. And the first thing I would like to do is to tell you something about the background of the research, and then we'll come to the second part, and I'll focus on some of the outcomes. We have limited time, so I had to make a selection, of course. About the background, if we look at the members of the WGAC, you could say the keyword is diversity. We have very different cultures and languages. We have different backgrounds on history and politics. We have different media systems, different views on journalism. So there is a lot of diversity, and we cherish this diversity. It is always good to learn from one another and to go beyond the time that the United States were leading our field and everybody was following that. I mean, it is good that we have a real interaction worldwide now. Despite all this diversity, there are also many issues we share across the globe, and the next slide is meant for that. Yeah, now I have to, yeah, this is the one. We have the same kind of educational dilemmas. For instance, the dilemma about the concept, are we working with a narrow or a broad definition of journalism? For instance, the question, do we educate journalists, or are we in an era where we educate media workers, which is obviously broader? It's also a dilemma with respect to the expertise. Do we have a curriculum that is skill-based or is oriented towards more academic reflection? For instance, the question, do we learn our students to do journalism or to study journalism? There is also a dilemma with regard to focus. Do we focus on the news industry, or do we focus on society? For instance, the question, are we training for a job, or are we educating for a profession? And then we have the maybe one of the most important issues nowadays, that is about our mission. Do we choose for realism or idealism? Do we follow journalism as it actually develops, whether or not we like it? Or are we focusing at a journalism as we would wish it to develop? That is a different ball game. So beside all these dilemmas we share, we also share some major trends in journalism, and there are a lot of trends, but I selected 4 of them. The first one is in the technological field. Because of technology, we now have many more news suppliers than we used to have, and technology has made it possible to surpass journalism, for instance, by directly communicating politicians to the public through Twitter, to mention just one example. And it's not only politicians who surpass journalists. This means that there is an ending of the monopoly on news. On the economic side, we see that news is seen as free in a growing measure, especially among the young. As was mentioned, I do a lot of research among young people, and they think it is, I think about 90% of them finds that news should be free. We see disrupted business models, and the trend is the ending of the scarcity of news. On the social field, we see the ending of mass audiences and a moving towards communities and towards target groups. And in the relational field, we see a clear ending of one-way sending, and instead of that, interaction and cooperation are coming to the forefront, which is quite a change for journalists, I must say. Now, these trends more or less represent a transition from a very successful mass media period to the new period of the network model. And this transition gives a feeling of crisis. There has been a lot of literature on the crisis of journalism and on the need to rethink journalism or to reconsider it or to rebuild it or whatever. So we are in need of a new type of journalism, and therefore we are in need of renewal, of innovation. Now, if we look at the innovation debate in journalism and in journalism education as well, there often is a strong focus on the means, the technological means. If I have been to many conferences about the future of journalism, and after 5 minutes we're talking about drones, and we're talking about robots, and we're talking about all kinds of technological means. And if we do not talk about the technology, we talk about the financial side, the business models, the entrepreneurship, the pitching, the startups, etc. Now, this is important. It is important to talk about the means, especially for the news media themselves. But I think the debate should not only be about the means of journalism, but it should also be about the goals of journalism. And when we talk about goals, next slide, please, we talk about roles and values of journalism, which is not about technology, which is not about economics, but it is equally important, if not more important. And if we talk about roles and values, you could say we talk about journalism culture in a broader sense. Now, there has been a lot of international research on journalistic roles and values, as you probably know. Most of this research is pointed towards professional journalists. And I guess many of you are aware of the Worlds of Journalism study. The new wave is coming up now. And many journalists in over 90 countries in the world will be surveyed. There's also a lot of research on journalism students, for instance, the Journalism Students Around the Globe project. But the strange thing is, the missing link are the journalism teachers. There is not much research on journalism teachers, and I don't want to overestimate their role, but I think journalism teachers are very important, especially in a time of transition when you want to go from one model of mass communication in society to another. And I think schools should not be in the follower mode, but in the innovation mode, and journalism teachers are essential for that. So that is a main reason to start a role and value research on journalism teachers. And we started this in Europe with this study, Journalistic Roles, Values and Qualifications, how journalism educators in Europe view the future of a profession in transition. It was completed about 2 years ago. You can get it without charge. You can download it as a PDF. And it gave so many interesting results that the idea was born to do it also on a global level. In this research, the next slide, we use the line of questioning that is used in roles and values research. For instance, this is just an example of one of the many questions, but the question was compared to today. Sorry, in the next 10 years, the importance of the following tasks for professional journalism should become, and then you get a list of about 20 different tasks going in various directions. So this is about the background of the study. Now I would like to turn to some of the outcomes. As I said, we did this study in Europe, and now at the moment we are in the process of analyzing the data which we gathered at the beginning of this year globally. And today we will focus on Asia Pacific, and the countries that are involved were already mentioned by Ramon. Some were hardly represented, for instance, Laos with only one respondent, but nevertheless, Laos was there. Before we go into the more interesting part, I first would like to say something about the characteristics, the background characteristics of this population of teachers in Asia Pacific. And let's start by the average age, or the age building of the teachers group. We see that in China, the teachers are the youngest. If we look at the group under 40, 38% in China is under 40, as compared to 11 or 13% in Europe, Nordic and Oceania. Asia Pacific is also rather young. It is, if we would not have China, Asia Pacific would have the youngest population in these 8 regions. So we can remember that they're rather young, which is often an advantage if you want to change and renew. If we look at the next slide and we look at gender, we see that in Africa, journalism education is mostly a male affair, whereas in Russia, it is clearly a female affair. And Asia Pacific is the only one that has gender balance. So congratulations with that. There are 47% male and 50% female teachers. So this is rather in balance. Asia Pacific is in the middle. So young and not specifically male or female. The next one is about education, which is a bit difficult because, for instance, what a PhD degree really means, what you have to do to earn a PhD degree, differs across the world. So comparison is always a little bit difficult. But nevertheless, we see that in Russia, the educational level is very high with a lot of PhD degree, and the same more or less goes for China, whereas in Europe, Nordic, I left out the European data because they are 2 years older than these, although the comparison still could be made. But these are the figures of this round. Europe Nordic, we have 40% with a PhD, and Asia Pacific is on, let's say, on the lower side of that. Most of the regions on the globe have a majority of PhD students, and Asia Pacific and Europe Nordic do not have that. Now, often if you have high levels of education, you have low levels of practical experience. It is not a law, but that is often the case. And we see it in China, for instance, with a high rate of PhD teachers, but 82% has less than 6 years, so 0 to 5 years of experience. And I can say that many of them have 0 years of experience. On the other hand, we have Oceania, mostly Australia, where it is very, very common to have more than 15 years of experience in the journalistic practice. So this is a rather big difference, and it more or less defines your outlook on what journalism is, what is important, how far the distance from the industry should be, etc., etc. Asia Pacific is on the Chinese side, let's say. Is on the lower side. Of course, we already saw that the average age is low. These are young teachers, so the chance of having 70 years of experience, as some of us have, that is not very likely if you have a young population. But still, only 20%, a bit more than 20%, has more than 15 years of practical experience. So these background characteristics also define your view on the topics that matter, like what should be in the curriculum, etc., etc. And it's always good to realize how your teacher and your staff is made up in terms of background characteristics. Now let's go to journalism culture, the roles and the values. The general definition and short definition of what a culture is the values of a particular group as shown in their behavior, their habits, their attitudes, and their beliefs. And I think this is a rather good short definition, but in order to be able to do empirical research, it needs to be operationalized further. And that is what we did on the basis of the European data. We saw that if we deconstruct journalism culture, you could say that culture exists on orientations on four main basic dimensions: orientation toward the audience, towards power, towards time, and towards reality. And this was one of the first major findings in the European study, and we're at this moment finding more or less the same structure in the global data. The next step was, if we have these dimensions, from where to where do they go? What is the beginning and the end of that dimension? Because a dimension is a line, and we found eight positions. The audience orientation, the line goes from a consumer orientation to a citizen orientation, and there are teachers who are on one side, there are teachers who are on the other, and there are many who are somewhere in the middle. The power dimension goes from a neutral stance towards power to an adversarial position. Time goes from journalism as a profession that is turning around being fast, and the other hand, we have teachers who think journalism should be slow in order to have more time to reflect and to do the research, etc. And with regard to reality, there are also two extreme positions, and most of the teachers are somewhere in between. One position is that there is a social reality out there, and the only thing we have to do is to mirror that social reality. The other is that is more a constructivist view of reality. We as journalists are one of the parties that is shaping social reality by the choices we make. So we have, that is the interventionist position. And some of them take it so far that they say we have to use that position, for instance, to promote social change. Now, these 8 positions appear to be strongly interlinked. Some strongly, some less strongly, and some none. Here you have the 8 positions which I mentioned in the slide before, and you see the connections between the positions and where there are no connections. And if we take this one step further to the next slide, we can see that there are 2 main clusters, let's say a blue cluster and a yellow cluster. The yellow cluster, you could start with the fast position. It is linked to the mirror, the neutral, and the consumer position, and there are cross links between them. And the other cluster starts with citizens, which is linked to interventionist, slow, and adversarial, and slow and adversarial in turn are also strongly related. These clusters have very high correlations. And if we look at the highest ones, we could distillate 4 major roles of journalism in the view of teachers, in the eyes of teachers. So in the next slide, you will see which are the 4 roles of journalism that the teachers defined, not knowing that they were doing that because they were just answering questions, but with our techniques and factor analysis, etc., we found that there are 4 major roles of journalism, which are not uncommon. If you are familiar with the roles research on journalists themselves, for instance, you will find 4 roles or 5 roles that look like these ones, but they're built up in a different way. The first role is disseminator role, which is fast and yeah, maybe one slide back, sorry, which is built up from the fast and the consumer position. The investigator role, slow and adversarial. The mobilizer position, interventionist, aimed at citizen. And the observer, the detached observer, sees himself as a neutral mirror of reality. So these are the 4 roles of journalism. And again, it is important for teachers to realize what type of role, in their view, might be the most important one. And a lot of discussions, my experience in over 40 years is that a lot of discussions about curricula somewhere get to a difficult point and you don't know why. And if you realize, okay, but you are, the teacher 1 is having a mobilizer view on journalism and the other has an observer view, then you know why they don't agree. So this is an interesting way of looking at it. Now, today I would like to focus at 2 of the roles, and you can see it in the next slide, the disseminator and the investigator role. And here you see the items that are used for the scales that I have used later on, that constitute these roles. And I can say that the Cronbach alphas are all above 0.8, so there is a strong scale reliability of both of them. Okay, the disseminator and the investigator. Now, if you look at all the tasks that we asked about, and we asked about the future importance of those tasks, and not what you think will be the future importance, but what you would like to be the future importance, is what direction you would like journalism to go. We find the first outcome is on the next slide. We find that all the tasks that are related to the fast journalism have an average score below 100, with one exception, get information to the public quickly, which is slightly above 100, which means that, and these are the global figures, green are the global figures. So on the global level, teachers in general see a diminishing role of all the tasks that are related to the role of the disseminator. If we look at Asia Pacific and we compare it to the global figures, we see that it is the same pattern. So that might be a comforting idea. But also we see that they are less pessimistic or less inclined to believe that the disseminator role will go down, although they will. In general, they think it will go down, but less than global. Sorry, there is some noise now here, but I will try to ignore it. In the next slide, we have done the same with the investigative tasks. And here on the global level, you see the tasks that belong to the investigator role all have a score way beyond 100. So they are found to be more important, at least wished for. And on spot number 1 is provide in-depth background information and then provide analysis, etc. So it is clear that this represents a shift to lower attention for the disseminator role and strongly more attention for the investigator role. But how is that in Asia Pacific? Well, if we take Asia Pacific, again, we see the same overall pattern, but to the extent is, again, less. So the trend that I just mentioned, less disseminator, more investigative, is also there in Asia Pacific, but on a, let's say, lower extent or a lower level, not that much. Now, if we go a little bit more into detail, we have divided the globe in 8 regions: North and South America, Nordic Europe, Russia, China, Asia Pacific, Oceania, and Africa. And the first slide I would like to show you, and I hope it is also in the slide that is now being, yes, that's the good one. It is far too much for a PowerPoint presentation. I realize that it's impossible to read everything what is here. But on the left side, the tasks that we asked about are mentioned, and in the table itself, we have put the position of that task from 1 to 18, because there were 18 tasks we asked about, and then we took the ranking of each of the regions. So the global ranking is the standard, you could say, and it has on number 1, stay away from stories that cannot be verified, and then the next follow, and on the bottom we have, on the real bottom, we have treat the public as consumers rather than citizens. That got the least support. So this is the ranking, the global ranking, and it was more or less, well, it is striking to see that in all global regions, we totally agree there is complete consensus, or not complete, there are little changes. Some has a task on 18 and another has it on 17 and in the reverse, but there is a very high level of consensus about the bottom 5, which are, and it's difficult for me to read too: concentrate on bringing the latest news, providing entertainment, make as many stories as you can each day, concentrate on news that will sell, and treat the public as consumers rather than citizens, which all reflect the kind of commercial tasks, the commercial oriented tasks of journalism, but also some of the fast journalism tasks, you could say, like bringing the latest news. Now, if we look at the green zone, there is there is still a lot of consensus, but a little less. And the overall consensus you can see is in the rank correlation, which is the bottom line, which has very high rank correlations, which means they're all compared to the global ranking, which means that that in each region is every region is rather close to the global one, maybe except for one, and that is Asia Pacific, which has a rank correlation of 0.62, which is, for a rank correlation, not a very high figure. One of the reasons to explain it, at least in a statistical way, is if you look at the number 1 global, it is on number 13 in Asia Pacific. So stay away from stories that cannot be verified. The world champion is number 13 in Asia Pacific, whereas the number 1 in Asia Pacific is get information to the public quickly, and that is the number 12 globally. So that is quite a difference, and it explains more than half of the low rank correlation. If I had to make a conclusion on the basis of this table, and there is a lot more to say than I just did, I would say that it is rather astonishing that despite all our differences, despite the diversity, we agree on so many things, which is an interesting outcome. Now we go to the next slide. We go from the tasks to the roles again, the investigator role and the disseminator role. And what we know, first, first the investigator role. Here we have the 8 regions again, and we see that all regions believe that the investigator role will become more important in a relative sense. but not all in the same way. Russia, China, Asia Pacific, and Africa have a different view than the other 4 regions. It is gradual, it's not principle, but it's gradual and it is significant. Now, if we look at the disseminator role, you already had a peak view. There it is. We see it in the opposite direction. In all regions, we believe that the disseminator role will become less important. And this is, of course, for education, also a very important fact to consider. Europe Nordic is in the lead with regard to the disseminator role. I must say within Europe, the Nordic countries are always in the lead with all kinds of new trends. So from the Netherlands, it's always interesting to see what happens in countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, because what they do after 5 years will be in the Netherlands too, and then it goes further down in Europe, one could say. So the pattern again is the same in all regions, but as you can see, Asia Pacific is the most modest one with regard to the yellow as well as to the blue sign, to say it like that. What does this mean for qualifications of students? We have asked about many qualifications. It would result in a series of 5 or 6 slides. I would not do. I chose not to do that. I just chose some of the qualifications we asked about, qualifications that students have to have after completion of their study. And so students must be able to select information on the basis of reliability, sorry. They have to be able to evaluate sources, find multiple perspectives, etc., and work on the time pressure, of course. And again, we looked at which are the growers and which are the diminishers, to say it like that. And it is clear that every qualification that has to do with the investigator role has a growth in it, an expected growing importance, whereas working under time pressure goes down rather strongly. And I must say this is a rather big change with 10 years ago, because 10 years ago we did a similar research in Europe about qualifications among teachers. And at that time, working under time pressure was in the top 3 qualifications of importance. So it went from a very high position to a very low position, which reflects the change in thinking about journalism over the past decade. What about Asia Pacific, if we compare it to the global results? Well, it's getting a little boring perhaps, but Asia Pacific again shows the same pattern as the global pattern, but again, most of the time in a little more modest way, but not that much. There's not so much change of a difference, I mean. Now there is another issue that we research, and that is about possible future trends in journalism. That is the next slide, and it is a bit of a busy slide. But we asked the teachers the question: it would be good if journalism was more about, and then, for instance, more about getting the whole story and less about trying to be first. What would be good if journalism was more about social responsibility and less about earning money, more about interacting with the audience and less about one-way sending, and so on. The 2 I mentioned first are the 2 that are on the top, and when we look at the bottom, we find 3 that are on the left side, on the let's say on the negative side of 100. They are all connected to what is called constructive journalism nowadays, which also has some significance. but the teachers globally thought that the least important trends were that journalism should be more about consensus and less about conflict, more about what's next and less about what happened, so more future oriented and less past oriented, and more about successes and less about failures. So we have 2 high scores and 3 low scores, and the rest is more or less in the middle. How is that in Asia Pacific? Same story as always, maybe with one exception, which I will come to. And the same story is that we see precisely the same pattern globally we see in Asia Pacific too. Again, more modest, less outspoken. This is not a result of a different answering style. In global research, you always have to look to answering style, because in one country, people tend to be more modest when they have a scale from 1 to 5 or from 1 to 7, and others are more outspoken and are likely to choose a 7, whereas in other cultures they do not use a 7 but a 6 or a 5 maximum. But in this case we have used the relative figures, so we compare the countries with themselves, their own averages. It is maybe a bit too technical for this, but I can only assert that it's not this outcome is not due to answering styles that might be different in Asia than in USA, for instance. The main difference is that there is less agreement with the one about it should be good if journalism was more about renewing journalistic content and less about new technology. So that has less support in Asia Pacific, this statement, this trend. Now, I think I have used a lot of time already, so I will go to a summary. With regard to the trends in journalism, and some of the required qualifications, trends and the qualifications, there is no huge difference between Asia Pacific and the rest. The same goes for point B. Teachers from Asia Pacific see a growing importance of the investigator role and a diminishing importance of the disseminator role. The next summarizing conclusion, number C, is that teachers from Asia Pacific are less convinced about the diminishing importance of the disseminator role. And finally, they are also less convinced about the growing importance of the investigator role. Now, on the global level, and this is my final sheet, teachers clearly prefer more attention for investigator type skills. And these are, I have mentioned 5 of them. Verification skills, which become much more important. You can click. Yeah, for example, fact-checking, research skills, finding in-depth issues, analytical skills, social skills, and language skills. And in my view, and in the view of many of the teachers we surveyed, these are the top 5 priorities for the years ahead. So, final slide. Thank you very much for your attention. It may have been a little bit longer than, but I could not make other choices. Sorry for that. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kroc. That was very insightful, thought-provoking, and we realized a lot about our teachers and, of course, the future of journalism education. Before we continue, allow me to recognize the Director for Strategy and Policy of UNESCO, Mr. Guy Berger. Hi, sir. He's with us here at the backstage. It's nice to have you. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. And also, I'd like to say hi to all of our viewers online, and they are giving their comments as you speak, Dr. Drock, and allow me to read some of them. Anita said, very insightful takeaway and point to ruminate for media educators, teachers, in light of considerable global consensus on journalism teaching qualification and ethics for future approaches. She said further, need to work together to adopt facilitative strategies for teaching more towards constructive journalism. And Veronica agreed to her. And also, Cassandra said she has learned a lot, many things that she can use as a youth school journalist. It's a great opportunity for us to learn about journalism for free. So once again, thank you so much. Now we are ready for our reactors. I'm going to introduce them at once, and then they will give their 10-minute reaction to Dr. Drok's presentation. Allow me to introduce to you our first reactor. He is a professor from Manipal Institute of Communication, Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India. He's a former director of Indian Institute of Mass Communication, founding vice chancellor of Central University of Tamil Nadu, pro-vice chancellor and professor of communication, University of Hyderabad. Our first reactor is Professor B.P. Sanjay. Our next reactor is an honorary professor of Technology and Reach Learning Initiative from the University of Hong Kong, and a professor and founding director from the same university's Journalism and Media Studies Center, Professor Ying Chan. And finally, we have the editor of Media Asia and a colleague from the Department of Journalism, Associate Professor of the University of the Philippines College of Mass Communication, Professor Danilo A. Arao. Friends, let's have our reactions. Let's start with Professor Sanjay. Sir? Please unmute, sir. There you go.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ramon. Thank you, Professor Nico, for the excellent presentation on both the world trends as well as the trends in Asia and Pacific. In the first place, I particularly liked your approach in trying to recognize the diversity of the context that you were studying. I think it makes a significant input to the quality and nature of the research. As well as the fact that, Asia Pacific region does represent a different kind of system. But at the same time, I'm not very sure whether at some point in time, the governance structures in the Asia Pacific region was indeed a variable. If it was a variable, probably it has not been factored as such. Maybe somewhere in your database, that factor is also there. Now, why do I talk about the governance structure? Because to my mind, Asia Pacific region has a very strong component of states' interests in certain areas, particularly, for example, broadcasting, not so much in print. And the state is also very active in social media regulation and framework. So the differences in governance structures to some degree might shape the functioning and response of the media overall. Now, that is something that I thought that I could flag it in terms of the relationship. The Second aspect, which is very crucial, and you have correctly identified, is the specific roles you attribute and focus to journalism teachers rather than journalists per se. But however, what happens is that somewhere in your presentation, you also use the word, do they follow the industry or are they innovating? I think was something that you raised as an important variable. Now, what happens, and this has a bearing on some of your other slides with regard to the skills and expectations as well. Now, when you look at the profile of the Asia Pacific region, and I think you did mention that they border on being in the younger age group based on your study. The important thing here is whether journalism teachers in the Asia Pacific are currently competent and comfortable in being innovative. And that begs the question that if they can't be innovative, do they follow the industry? If they follow the industry, then their aspect of attitude towards teaching will always be based on the fact that the industry expectations of their graduates requires a higher sensitivity to their practices, good or bad. No, we are not standing in judgment over the righteousness or the wrong nature of the industry practices. So probably this also perhaps has a bearing to the relatively low score you found in terms of the disseminator and the investigator relationship that you particularly highlighted with regard to the Asia Pacific region. Now, Asia Pacific region to some extent in the past did imbibe a lot of adversarial practices of mass media that were practiced elsewhere. But over a time and in between, assumed a development and a social responsibility role in the era of development paradigms. So there is a significant amount of sensitivity among the teachers with regard to the underlying development paradigms, which they think that journalism or communicators should practice. Now, this is also kind of related to the relationship between, as I said, the development sector and the media generally. Now, having said this, let us get to some of the specifics that you have talked about. Now, for example, in India, I think your survey had about 28 respondents from the 249. And I'm not engaging in the significance of the number. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to point out is that the one variable that you talked about in the diversity aspect, you would probably recognize that the responses from India would span across the 8 or 6 diversity factors that you talk about: the multilingual, the multicultural, the multi-religious, and the spread of the social media, etc. So the respondents many a time might find it difficult to grapple with one omnibus question to reflect the diverse contextual attitudes and responses. I think in your slide on factor analysis, you have said you have made a very sincere attempt to kind of, relate what happens when, that's a statistical technique, which I'm not too aware of, but I do go by your analysis to say that you have taken enough pains to kind of, statistically analyze the relationship, etc. Now, the other point is, are we looking at the contours of the media? And what is the ism in journalism now? Now, this is a very important question, not only in India, but elsewhere. Now, the ism in journalism, according to many practitioners, and we have a very senior practitioner, Crispin here, has a very long tradition of what journalism ought to be, what journalism is, and what journalism can be in the future. I mean, that is something that it has a relationship of, let us say, ideology, framework, etc., etc. So when you kind of, root it into journalism and conflate it to the availability of information channels. Now, you also pointed out that many are getting into the news channel areas as well. I mean, that you talked about the multiplicity of sources that exist as against the traditional. I think one of your slides talked about the increasing nature of journalism. Now, you would also notice, Nick, that there is a distinction now arising between news aggregators and news sources, which may have a bearing on the verifiability and credibility aspect as well. So the mere increase in news sources, particularly in a country like India, has not necessarily meant that the diversity and plurality of our democratic spaces has increased. No, it has not. In fact, many intellectuals and teachers of journalism are increasingly getting worried that journalism is constricting. I mean, to use the familiar Habermasian expression, journalism is constricting the public space to such an extent. And this might be, as you said, factor of industry, and you also talked about the financial model. But I particularly like your analysis that we should not be technocentric to the extent of forgetting the values of journalism. I think that was an excellent point, Nico. I think that's something that, is a very good takeaway for us, where you talked about robots, you talked about drones. But the next slide talks about what is the lasting and the sustaining value in journalism. I think that is where, the survey has a very good kind of, direction for journalism teachers across, where they should be now in a position to separate the means of disseminating their content as against what the content itself should be. And that is where I particularly like the emphasis on values, the emphasis on content, the emphasis on verifiability, all the traits that somehow, somewhere in between, we had lost in journalism. And this also partially explains why the difference you found between the global emphasis on the verifiability, investigating role, and the lack of it probably, or the low esteem of that in Asia Pacific. I mean, I was particularly looking at the graphs of your slide, which is considerably low. I mean, there are two peaks, and in between you have the Asia Pacific, slides. Now, what does it mean? It means two things. It means, have we in the region lost sight of the the real values of what a journalist should be. And that has a reflection on our teaching. That has a reflection on our teaching and on our reflection in terms of what we should be doing to the teachers. Second point is that, has the industry practices suddenly changed? You talked about, should I be the first in journalism to break the news? The breaking news concept in India or elsewhere probably has also a reflection on our teaching. Be the first and not necessarily verified. So the survey to me has a lot of, what should I say, a semiotic framework for me to read and understand what essentially could be the contours of our curriculum. I don't look at it purely as numbers, Nick. I look at it from the point of view, what is it that I can take in terms of the philosophy of education versus vocational training in the university system, the philosophy of what the content should be and what should be the levels of verifiability. These are some of the important things that I made extensive notes on each one of your 42 slides. Maybe at a later point in time I can share it, but I think the scope given to me in this panel is about 8 to 10 minutes. I may have taken more time or less time, I don't know. But, I congratulate you for sensitizing us. One, I congratulate you for the comparative perspective that you brought about. And the last point that I also would like to highlight is the separation of China and Asia Pacific. Journalism in China, the way we understand, and journalism elsewhere, I think has a little bit of a difference in terms of the promotion of the state and the party and other interests. There are connotations of what journalism is, and I don't want to get into a debate. So I think what exactly journalism is in the future is also an important question that determines how a journalism teacher responds to. Creating awareness probably no longer is a function, but interpreting how one should be aware may be more important. Using technology may be important, but compressing the content to suit the technology means might be equally important. What do you see, when, and how may become important values for journalists in countries like ours. And, I'm glad that you didn't bring in the variable of democracy, democratic principles, etc., which we have in the past looked at, because that framework overwhelms the true intent of the survey with regard to journalism and journalism training. I'm very glad that you did not impose a value system on what you studied. And I think to that extent, this study is very important to us. And I'll be very glad to join in when others raise a question or you yourself have a query to me. I'll be here throughout and be in a position to respond, either slide specific or my comments that I have made generally. Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much, Raman, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sanjay. Now let's hear it from Professor Yin Chang.
Hi, great to see everybody. Thank you for inviting me here. I got to know AMIC maybe 20 years ago when I first started at Hong Kong U when I came back to Hong Kong. So good to see old friends and new friends. And also thank you very much for the survey. I appreciate it very much. I think its value is that it mapped for us an ecosystem of journalism educators globally and also in Asia. So we have a global ecosystem and one specific to Asia, and the comparison has given us comparative perspective, which is very important. And so I will just highlight some findings that I find very interesting, and also then from these slides draw to some tentative conclusions in the way of going forward. First, I was quite struck by slide 18. See, I have to print it out to read it very closely. And you can see that I marked it very carefully. And this slide 18 is on years of practical experience. I'm quite struck by the contrast between China and then Asia Pacific and the rest of the world. And in China, 82% of the educators have less than 6 years of practical experience. Asia Pacific, 51%. Whereas in North America, in Europe, Nordic, about 1/3. So the difference is quite striking. And I think that's what prompt us to reflect the teachers, the educators we have in the academy. I'm not dogmatic to say that all journalism educators, they need to be have a background as a journalist and all that. I think we need diversity. We need practitioners. We need researchers and educators who have some practical experience, right? But then in terms of China, the 82% I think is very high, almost too high. And as Asia Pacific, 51%. So I think this is something to reflect on in terms of hiring, training, and promotional policies. And I will come to that later. So this is the first slide I found very interesting. Now, second, on a more macro level, the survey addressed types of educational dilemmas. Number one, narrow versus broad definition journalism. Second, skill-based versus academic reflection. And then third, news industry versus society. Fourth, realism versus idealism. Now, I see these dilemmas more as an ideal type of situations that we need to consider whether we're on this end or the other end or in between. Now, but the challenge of the dilemma is that reality demands journalism to be narrower and broader, to be skill-based as well as more reflective, that we need to address to the needs of the industry, but also that of society. And then we need to be realistic. We need to train students who can get jobs. We need to address to issues in society. But then we also need to keep our eyes on the North Star, our values. That's idealism, right? So what it means that the demands on journalism and journalism educators is that we need to be deeper and broader. Right? It's a huge challenge, but that's the reality we are dealing with. And I'll go into the deeper and broader dilemma later. Now, then I want to move quickly to the contrast between disseminative tasks and investigative tasks. I have the slides here as well. I find it fascinating. Yes, the trends in Asia Pacific in general reflects the global, but there are differences. The difference in that, as one of the speakers have addressed, is that Asia Pacific educators still put more weight and emphasis on disseminative tasks and less so on investigative tasks, quote, right? And the pattern is very consistent across the indicators, right? Now, I think this is an area of concern in that because we are in the age of information diffusion. Everyone who can produce information can claim to be a journalist, and they produce information. And yes, journals need to be faster, but you also need to be accurate. So it means that while we need to be faster, we need to still have the role of disseminating news, but that role, I think, is diminishing. The need for that role is diminishing in the industry and also in society. It also means that journalists today are required to be able to go deeper to not exactly investigative journalism or the role of investigator, because for the role of investigator, I would include in-depth journalism, like writing about COVID. How are we going to write about COVID? It happens every day, right? Or Omicron. Capturing the happenings, how many people die, how many people infected, those are important. But then it's also important for journalists to go deeper, to explain vaccination, relationships between the vaccines, this kind of vaccines, and the new viruses and emergence and all that. We need to able to explain that, call that investigation, which means that investigation need not be adversarial. Because of this diffusion of information, there's a greater demand on journalists to be able to give the fuller picture to the public. And so it worries me, even though there's the trend that it worries me. So for Asia, for investigative tasks, educators giving less emphasis to provide background information, to provide analysis, to monitor, to scrutinize government, and the pattern for lesser emphasis on, quote, investigative skills are consistent among Asia-Pacific educators, right? Actually, I would be very interested to look at further country breakdowns. I think that would be interesting. And also to look at maybe China, since that the data could be separated. So now, and then, so the summary from the professor did say that teachers from Asia-Pacific in general are less convinced about the diminishing importance of the disseminator. And they are less convinced about the growing importance of the investigative role. I think that's a matter of concern. We need to go deeper to look at why, and at a time when there's demand for journalists to shed more light on issues, to go for, as Maria Ressa say, to go for fact-based and evidence-based journalism. Now, so what does it mean going forward? I agree totally that on the global level, investigative skills are important: verification, research, analytical, social, and language. And it means that journalists today, they need technical skills. They need to be able to produce on multimedia platforms, not just to write for print, but have the ability to appreciate and to produce on multimedia platforms, appreciation of visual, appreciation of digital, and they need to have those basic skills. That means educators, we need to keep learning to catch up with it. So, so for journalists today and journalism education today, we need to equip and prepare students to be able to manage and deliver on multimedia platforms with different level of expertise. And number two, I'm very convinced that journalists today also need subject knowledge. That means you need just not journalism, communication skills, you need plus law, plus a subject knowledge of public health, plus subject knowledge of computer sciences, plus subject knowledge of supply chain engineering. So you need an area of subject knowledge so that you can be right about. So, and or at least you need to know where to look for information, where to do the research, where to look for help, what kind of experts you will seek out, right? And so, but how can we do that? We can't be everything. We can be everything. So I think collaboration is one answer. Collaboration among educators, collaboration among journalism and communication schools, collaboration between faculties, meaning individual faculty members, or also among faculties of a subject like the law school and journalism, computer science and journalism. So we need to break down the silos and to bring the kind of education that students need to be prepared for the very complicated media industry that's out there and for the very demanding role that journalism are asked to perform. So I think I will stop here. Collaboration, multidisciplinary, breaking down silos, and so that we can address the dilemmas we are facing and to master them and to take these dilemmas to a high level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ying Chan. Now we will hear the reactions of Professor Danny Arao. Sir?
Good afternoon to all of you. This is just a very short reaction given the limited time that we have. First, congratulations to Professor Nico Drock for his extensive study on journalism education. Just like the Worlds of Journalism study of Hanich et al., which focuses on practicing journalists, we can say that Professor Drock's empirical findings on the state of journalism education will be the subject of discussion and debate in the years to come. Obviously, I take special interest in the Hanich project as a journalist, and most definitely, I take new interest in Professor Drock's research as a journalism educator. We can only hope that just like the Hanich initiative, there would be some effort to update this study every 3 years or so to determine trends and patterns in terms of perspectives of journalism educators around the world. To be particular about Asia, I hope Professor Drock doesn't mind. We hope that we can go beyond 239 respondents from 13 countries to get a better picture of the regional situation. And while there is much to reflect on Professor Drock's 42 slides, let me focus on 2 points. First, it appears that journalism educators in the Asia Pacific are generally young, 20 to 39 years old, mostly female, generally with master's degrees, mostly with less than 6 years or fewer than 6 years practical experience. In terms of regional comparison, it appears that South America and Oceania have a better profile of educators, as most of them have more than 15 years of practical experience. Second, we should stress that the 4 roles of journalism, as mentioned by Professor Drock, are not necessarily mutually exclusive, as they tend to overlap, especially when analyzing the workings of the dominant media, or what Chomsky describes as the corporate media. There are efforts to investigate and speak truth to power, even if there are also certain aspects of news creation and production that point to the disseminator function, most especially when it comes to entertainment or infotainment, to be more precise. Now, in the context of journalism education, there is a need to put into context the political and economic circumstances of the country. Now, the Philippines proves to be an interesting case study because of an interesting mix of educators who are either progressive, conservative, or oblivious to the media situation. Much as we have journalism educators who are activists, there are also journalism educators who support the repression of and the crackdown on certain news media organization. So that particular aspect could be given some emphasis when it comes to research, not just in the Philippines, but also in other parts of the world. Nevertheless, the future of journalism, having said all of these things, is promising, even if the current situation may be depressing. Here in the Philippines, despite the prevalence of fake news, we see the commitment to truth-telling. Despite the reign of tyranny and impunity, we see the commitment not just to hold the line, but to also sharpen the line. Much as there are journalists who have learned to fight back against various forms of media repression, there is also a trend among certain journalism students in asserting not just press freedom, but also academic freedom. Finally, let me stress that the investigator role remains important in Asia, especially in countries and territories that are plagued by various forms of media repression. Certain aspects of the disseminator role remains crucial in terms of sharing relevant facts and in fighting disinformation. As the current editor of Media Asia, I should end this short reaction in just 5 minutes by inviting research on communication and journalism education in Asia that can complement this commendable initiative of Professor Drock. Okay, just for the record, I delivered this reaction in 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Thank you. Nice day.
Thank you very much, Professor Danny Arao. Thank you all to our reactors. You just made our participants more excited about their role as teachers, their role as educators, and as journalists as well. And so they have questions. They have sent in their questions, and allow me to ask them to our speaker and our reactors. This one is for Dr. Drock. What do you think about techno skills of journalism teacher?
You can look at that question from several angles. I think in general, of course, technological skills for journalism teachers, at least part of the teachers, not all of them, but it is necessary. It is part of the job, just as a doctor has to know how to use new equipment. Journalists also have to know how to use new equipment. I have not done research about the level of technological knowledge, but it is my impression, and not more than that, that the level of technological wisdom and knowledge is not up to date in most parts of the world. I mean, education is in most cases lagging behind, and this is in part a financial issue, of course, because it is very hard to stay at the cutting edge, because you have to invest a lot of money every year. But it's also something that once you have appointed a teacher, they are out of practice and they lose contact with new developments. So this is, I think this is a real difficult global issue. It is important, but it is very difficult to stay on the cutting edge. On the other hand, I must say, it would be good not to chase every new thing that it comes on the market. I mean, I have had discussions, what should we do with Twitter? What should we do with Facebook? What should we do? And now it's TikTok, and then it is, I mean, these technologies, they move so fast, but it's important for students to understand the general the red line in all those technologies.
All right, thank you, sir. Any of our panelists can answer this question. What if the journalists or the journalism teachers themselves are the source of fake news or disinformation? What can we do? I can see your greens there. So anyone who would like to, yes, Professor Sanjay.
Thank you. The question is, to what extent does a teacher or a journalist separates himself or herself from the context in which they live and function? Now, the question that has been asked is what happens if the journalism teacher himself or herself is a source of fake news? One is the sensitivity that the teacher necessarily brings about in the classroom, that fake news is really a menace and should be avoided at any cost, is one sensitivity that every right-thinking journalist, journalism teacher will always bring. But what also happens is that the journalism teacher, when he steps out of the teaching profession and gets into the role of either a citizen or an ordinary person, the tendency to kind of, get into the enthusiasm of the social media platform and either forward or give voices or echo the sentiments is something that happens. And that is probably the reason why this question is being asked. But I would say as journalism teachers, we should refrain from, but only comment on the genesis and fact checking, etc. That would be an ideal role. If we can perform that, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sanjay. Professor Arao, please.
Yeah, I think they should be called out, of course, at varying levels. For journalists, it's more convenient to call them out publicly because usually the journalistic outputs are a matter of public consumption. It's publicly available. However, for teachers, whether or not you call them publicly or privately, that would depend on the circumstances as well as the kind of university that you belong to. If the university has a liberal form of education, then calling them out publicly would be just fine. But if it's a little bit conservative, then that would be a different matter altogether. The bottom line here is just like what Professor Sanjay says, there is no room for disinformation in the academe and in the media, and they should be called out accordingly. And I hope that it affects their tenure and promotion in the process. I'm just kidding. Thank you.
Definitely. All right. Thank you, Professor Danny Arao. All right, let me proceed to the next question. This is, I think, for Dr. Drock. What are the additional skill set that a journalism educator needs to have in the next coming years? Maybe aside from the technological skills, of course, that we talked about a while back. Dr. Drock?
Yeah, well, of course it all depends on your curriculum because you have to carry out the curriculum, and curricula can differ a lot. But I would say, and it is mentioned, for instance, by Professor Ying Chang, knowledge is apart from the skills I mentioned at the end of which are important for students as well as for teachers. So all these investigator-like skills, I find often in discussions with journalism teachers at several places that they are often also a little bit stuck in the breaking news paradigm. And so I would like journalism teachers, and certainly those who have a lot of practical experience, which I think is very important and we should value enormously. But it is necessary that they also read about communication science and what insights we have there. And many of the teachers, the practical teachers in Europe, don't read mass communication journals, scientific journals, for instance. So I think on the knowledge communication science, as well as all kinds of specialistic fields, that is very important. And for a student, it is very good to have a teacher that knows about the past, but also has a vision and an idea about the future, and can combine the insights in journalism with insights in society and knowledge fields. And I think we too often have different departments. Journalism teachers are for the skills and others are for the knowledge, and this should be more integrated. There's a lot to say about this, and the asker of the question can always mail me if they want, but they have to expect a mail back of 10 pages, something like that.
Oh, wow. That should be fine. That should be fine. Right. Okay. I'll treat these two questions relatably, right? The first would be, how do we handle the misconception or devaluation of journalism globally? In one instance, here in the Philippines, we have news media outlets who have become the mouthpiece of the government. Even though we have journalism organizations self-policing their ranks, barely anything was done to address their partisan journalism. How can media ethics teachers discuss this in the classroom when the self-policing role of media organizations is virtually non-existent? Anyone? Yes, Professor Sanjay, please.
See, I mean, not that in the Indian context, this kind of an alignment with the power structures of either the state or the corporates, it has occurred to a very significant extent. But what also has occurred is the rise of, within quotes, independent, very active news portals. Now, as one journalist who did the survey pointed out, that when you are vulnerable to a corporate, or the example you gave in as the state pressure, or by default you align with them because either for your survival or out of fear, the hope is that some of the news portals who do not have the scale of investment to mobilize audience and to get into advertising support, they have other models of sustenance, which in the Indian context is speaking volume about the future of journalism. Second, if the pressures are so overwhelming, the argument is that the portal might go to crowdfunding and still survive. So how and where journalism exists through legacy media or through the new media is something that in the Indian context and its democratic traditions is being debated in a very big way. And ignoring the point that you mentioned, that many of the mainstream media have by default chosen to align with the interests of either the state or the corporate. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sanjay. Anyone else who would like to address that question? Okay, I'll go to the next set of questions. This is related to how journalism is being taught given the COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, our participants would like to know, this semester, we still experience COVID-19 effect and students still study online. They are learning with me journalism, and I teach them insight on journalism, cover story, etc. But how do we advise them to get the deep information from sources? Maybe given the limitations, no, right now. Yes, Dr. Drop, please.
Yeah, well, I acknowledge that this is a very difficult situation in which we're all in. The only thing I would like to say now is that the WGAC, also with the help of UNESCO, is publishing a book on online teaching in the beginning of next year. So this issue will be dealt extensively in that volume, and so I'll keep it there. I just wanted to mention that.
Sure. All right. Professor Aro, please.
Yeah. just quickly, from experience, actually, we cannot teach journalism or any other discipline solely through online learning. So it's either we go into hybrid mode or we really go back to a safe return to face-to-face classes. I would tend to be more biased with the physical setup of the classroom because as a teacher of online journalism, we need the computer laboratory to sort of level the playing field. In a situation where your students are very much affected by the pandemic, they don't have the gadgets to really perform their tasks as journalism students. Things can be very, very challenging. So the bottom line here is, in terms of journalism education, we need to be more level-headed. We need to be more realistic with what we can do. We have to acknowledge the fact that we cannot discuss everything in the courses that are assigned to us, and that we can only hope that the students will go beyond what we teach and research at their own time, and even if there may be certain limitations to the pandemic. So that's why journalism education, or any higher education learning for that matter, should take into account also the shortcomings of the government. We have to take them into account and to demand that there will be a safe return to face-to-face classes so that we can be better educators and students can learn more from the courses that we teach. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Danny. Before we continue, before I call on Professor Ying, I'd like to acknowledge joining us here at the backstage is Professor Olive Villafuerte, President of AIJC. Hi, Ma'am. Thank you for joining us. Professor Ying, please, your response to the question.
Yes, on the COVID question, it's a very good question because that's what we've been struggling with. Now, number one, I think face-to-face education is very important, almost indispensable. Mm-hmm. But then virtual teaching has also brought forth opportunities, and it has prompted COVID-19 and the limitations of it has prompted the industry to innovate. So that means that you can conduct interviews online via Zoom. It gives you more flexibility and more reach. People are more available. That number one. And number two is that you also need to be innovative in identifying your sources. So that's going to social media, going to data, going to LinkedIn, and you just have to be more innovative. And I don't think we'll return to face-to-face 100% like before. We'll have to face-to-face, but I think we will also learn from the innovations that has affected in the past very painful period and where it's still going on now. And we'll learn and get to a higher level.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, thank you. We have still, our participants are very active. They still have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. But this will be our last question for this session. How strong of a role should journalism educators and university journalism departments take in supporting, promoting, and protecting press freedom issues within their nations, societies, and cultures? I would ask everybody to please give their answer to this question. Let's start with Dr. Drock.
I think this is a very important issue. I think press freedom is under pressure everywhere across the world, and also studies on democratic values show that democracies are going down across the world. And being from a Western country, I think this is a very difficult period in history, and our future generations of students should not take anything for granted in that field. And the WGC again has made the Paris Declaration on the freedom of journalism education, which is a very good global declaration and was accepted by the UNESCO. I think it is important that our teachers as well as our students learn that we have this charter, and which underlines the greatest importance of press freedom, which is threatened not only by governments but also by big industry, also by oligarchs, also by the public nowadays. In some countries, as for instance in mine, the public broadcaster does not use its logos anymore when they go on the street because they are under attack from the public. So the threats come from all sides, but mainly, of course, from autocratic governments.
Thank you, Dr. Drock. Professor Sanjay, please.
See, of course, one overarching threat to press freedom naturally has been identified as, coming from the power of the state in either the federal political structure that we have. But there is an equal amount of pressure that is also coming from, the society at large in terms of the moral and cultural pressures on the functioning of the press. This has become more acute in OTT content, etc. That is something that particularly India is facing. Now, third point that I would like to say is the fear that journalism teachers or journalism practitioners have is somehow there is a feeling that what is happening around is so natural that there is not even a threat to freedom. This natural feeling that the freedom is not at all threatened is more dangerous than some of the things that we are talking about. That is something that we should worry about more. The naturalization feeling that complacent, everything is fine in our country, there is no threat to freedom. Because day in and day out, we see values, cross-country comparisons.
Yeah.
But I think that is something that I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Sanjay. Prof. Ying.
I agree with my previous two speakers. Press freedom is important. We have to defend it in our own different ways. I live in Hong Kong. I'm still in Hong Kong. I've been stuck for 2 years. I can't travel. So there's a lot of changes going on here. So I'm telling students is that, yes, we stick for values. We do what we can. And but also to expand the space we have. That's very important. And so, and it's also in adverse situations, it's even more important to equip ourselves to learn and to produce good work as much as possible in the space we have. So keep learning, don't give up, don't despair. That's my message to my students.
Thank you very much, Professor Chan. Professor Danilo Arao.
Yeah, with the repression that's going on, not just in the Philippines, but in other parts of the world, including Asia, we have no choice but to fight back and to really not just hold the line, but to sharpen the line. And we have to instill among our students a critical worldview of not just the media system, but the overall political system, because the media repression that's going on is a reflection of the widespread human rights violation that's happening. Here in the Philippines, many journalists have been killed, and in the same way, many activists, teachers, lawyers, even priests are being killed for the simple reason that they are accused of being communists. And sometimes being a communist is just simply the excuse of the state to repress legitimate opposition. So in this particular case, we have to really fight back. And if they see journalism as activism, then so be it. Because there are some lessons we can learn from activism, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. Because it's even inherent in terms of critical analysis in the investigator role that's mentioned by Professor Drock. We need to deepen and to make sense of the reality. So perhaps the more fundamental challenge for journalism educators out there would be not just to help students describe the reality, but to help change the reality to something that would really promote and uphold press freedom and other basic freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arao. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Drock, and our reactors, also Professor Sanjay, Professor Ying Chan, and Professor Danny Arao. Wow, jam-packed and very interesting discussion on this journalism education, the future of this. And before we continue with the final part of our program, the synthesis and the closing remarks, allow me to read the message from Mr. Guy Berger, of course. Sir, this is, he said, this is very interesting and UNESCO is pleased to support this dialogue. The future of journalism education depends on the future of journalism on the one hand and the future of education on the other. And besides the two hands, there is the head, the journalism educator's knowledge and ability to shape the future. Please keep an eye on UNESCO's journalism education series for upcoming resources, and check the most recent one on reporting on migrants and refugees. So once again, thank you very much to our panelists. Now, to formally close, to synthesize our discussion and formally close our event this afternoon, allow me to call on the chair of the Philippine Commission on Higher Education's Technical Committee for Journalism, my tatay in base, Professor Ben Domingo. Tatay Ben.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody. I'll try to be as brief as I can. It's already 5:02. So Dr. Maslog, Dr. Rupar, Professor Tuazon, Professor Drock, Professor Sanjay, Professor Chan, Professor Arao, and Professor Chico, fellow journalism educators, participants, guests, and friends. It was indeed a very enriching, enlightening, insightful to our AMIC post-conference on the future of journalism education. And we are now about to close. To the organizers, the presenter, and the reactors, congratulations. We cannot thank you enough. Very briefly, the conference was started by Dr. Maslog, who at 90 years old, it was his birthday just last week.
Oh, wow.
That he tried to let us understand and appreciate the fact that he shared his personal life experiences to emphasize the point that even at his age, he has not wavered. He continues to be active in journalism at a somewhat modified pace. Dr. Rupar, on the other hand, overcame weather and technological issues in New Zealand to be able to attend this session with us. And she shared the organizations, the World Journalism Educators Council's programs, activities, researches, and the roundtable discussions and conferences that it has been into over the past year. Professor Tuazon, from his side, gave us an overview of AMIC's participation in this activity and gave us an insight as to what to expect and what we should have expected this afternoon. In the first session, Professor Drock provided or divided his presentation into two parts, the background and the outcomes. I like how he presented the background, the diversity that he presented, diversity in the society, the educational dilemmas, the major trends in the field, the fact that we are in a mode of transition, the means, the debates as to the means of journalism, the goals of journalism, the roles and values. After that, he proceeded to the outcomes. And it was a very eye-opening set of results. It made me understand journalism better. It made me reflect on what journalism is now in the Philippines, in our neighboring countries, what journalism was then, and possibly in the future. One part that I liked in his presentation was his summary at the end, because it put together what he has just presented, and this made my work quite easier. And let me just let you go back to, I think it's slide number 37, summarizing. And I got filled up to the brim regarding his presentation. In the reaction of Professor Sanjay, he was quite analytical, somewhat critical, using his experiences in India as basis for his discussions, providing inputs that can help us further understand how things are in his country, in Asia Pacific, and of course in the world. He, however, mentioned about some gaps that he would have wanted to be included, like structures as affecting journalism education and journalism as part of the study. Professor Chan, is it Professor Ying or Chan, said that she appreciates the survey. She is quite, she liked how the journalism ecosystem was presented, and then mentioned about interesting findings that she would like to, and she discussed quite exhaustively, but I'll not get into that anymore because of time constraint. Professor Arao, meanwhile, was quite tough in his assessment of journalism education as is being handled vis-a-vis by a repressive government in the Philippines today. And as Guy Berger has said, the future of journalism is quite dependent on the kind of journalism that we have, journalism education that we have now. So we really have to take stock, because if, as Professor Arao said, if we will not fight for it, we will eventually lose in the end. I like the questions from the participants. Their mention of the level of technological skills that needed to be learned and practiced. Teachers as possible sources of fake news. Additional skill sets that journalism educators should have, and handling limitations of coverages during a pandemic situation like what we have now. By the way, I remember a few days ago that I was able to read Dr. Maslog's column in the Philippine Daily Inquirer titled "Our Parochial Philippine Press," which also presented a short assessment of journalism in the Philippines today. This one can be used as added input to our discussions here. Thus, to formally close this session, let me extend our gratitude to UNESCO, to the Asian Media Information and Communication Center, and the World Journalism Education Council for organizing this forum. And to our fellow journalism educators in attendance, including the other participants and guests, we thank you for sharing your precious 2 hours that I'm sure will help us better understand where we came from, where we are now, and where we're going to in our path to become more relevant while facing the multifarious challenges before us today and in the future. And let this be my final word, that the extent of our freedom in journalism is defined by our capability and willingness to fight for it. Good afternoon to everybody.
On that note, wow, very well said, Tatay Ben. Thank you so much for inspiring us even more, with your closing remarks and your synthesis. So that's it, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, for engaging with us in a fruitful and meaningful discussion and dialogue on the future of journalism, education in Asia Pacific and the world. And to everybody who's here in the Zoom room, thank you. Please keep still. We will have our photo up after our live program. So as we all learned this afternoon, we don't just hold the line, we sharpen the line, and of course, we change the reality. My name is Mark Lester Chico. Thank you for joining us again. Good afternoon. Keep safe. Mabuhay.